These repeated legal barriers are, Madam Deputy Speaker, very similar to those that we experience with all other removal flights, and we believe that we are fully compliant with our domestic and international obligations, and preparations for our future flights and the next flights have already begun. The European Court of Human Rights did not rule that the policy or relocations were unlawful, but they prohibited the removal of 3 of those on last night's flight. Those prohibitions last for different time periods, but are not an absolute bar on their transfer to Rwanda. Anyone who's been ordered to be released by the courts will be tagged while we continue to progress their relocation. While this decision by the Strasbourg court to intervene was disappointing and surprising given the repeated and considered judgments to the contrary in our domestic courts, we remain committed to this policy. This government will not be deterred from doing the right thing. We will not be put off by the inevitable legal last-minute challenges, nor we will allow mobs, Madam Deputy Speaker, to block removals.
Well, for more on this story, we're now joined by Steve Crawshaw, who's the Freedom from Torture's Director of Policy and Advocacy, and he's in the UK. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
All right, so perhaps let's start with where we're at in terms of the legal challenges, because a plane was about to take off this week, and minutes before it did, there was this legal challenge that came. Where are we on the legal front?
Well, you're quite right. There's been, if you like, a thicket of legal challenges in many ways, and Freedom from Torture was part of some of those, but a number of different organisations brought cases. And at different points, it was both about the principle of whether this plane should go ahead, or whether what was being called the transportations, if you like, to Rwanda, the extraordinary scheme that the British government has put forward, whether that should go ahead as a principle, and then whether the individuals should go forward or not. And the 100 came down slowly and slowly and slowly till yesterday there was only 7 left. And then, as you've just described, at the very last moment, even as the plane was literally on the runway, ready to go, and some were actually already on board, the European Court came in with its emergency ruling saying that it was not safe to go ahead. It needed to be held off until the issues were looked at more closely. There's another key, this comes back also to UK courts. There is going to be a key ruling, set of rulings, which will key hearings next month, where the substantive issues will be held. Priti Patel, the British Home Secretary, you played a piece of her there, sounding very defiant, as does Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. But everybody really who understands the issues has been highly, highly critical of the proposals the government's put forward.
So are these asylum seekers safe for the moment? Because the government seems to be taking a pretty definitive position that they're going to carry on regardless.
Yeah, as you say, it is pretty definitive. The British government is very good at doubling down and then doubling down and doubling down again. So when they find criticism, instead of engaging with the facts, let alone the humanity, they just say, this is what we're going to do, and they plough ahead with it. We've reached a situation now where, in the last couple of days, the assembled archbishops and bishops, the entire leadership of the Church of England, said this was shaming. Prince Charles was reported to have said that it was appalling. The UN said it was catastrophic. The Home Office's own staff were among those who brought the court challenges, saying, you should not be asking us to do this. The Border Force civil servants saying this is not be happening. So right across the board, there are so many protests in different ways, and there have been popular protests on the streets as well. The government doesn't really listen to any of this, and as you rightly describe, claim that they will just plough on regardless. They love to blame what they call the quote-unquote lefty lawyers, which of course ignores the fact that actually what a case being brought is kind of irrelevant. What's actually relevant is the judgments that are made by the judges, who they haven't yet started accusing of being lefty judges. But the judges have repeatedly also, in cases of the individuals so far, found against the government, saying that the individuals are too vulnerable for a variety of different reasons, and it would be not appropriate for them to go back to Rwanda. And as mentioned a moment ago, these main hearings will come next month. So I think the government is sort of on the back foot, but it's very good at pretending that it's not on the back foot, is the short version of where we are.
Does this mean that going forward, this is more likely to be a case-by-case type of scenario, and that if they continue to get the losses at the rate that they're getting, that this policy probably will collapse?
It's a very good one. There's a couple of questions there, but those are all good questions. As regards the individuals, the government loves to play this game of, instead of getting rid of a policy itself, which is bad, they, if you like, wear people down, that each one has to be a lawyer, has to bring it for this individual, and then this individual, and then this individual, where common sense tells you that actually the principle is wrong rather than the individual. But certainly that's the game that they've been playing. As regards to the second part of your question, whether they will eventually be worn down, I really, really hope so. And I think that it's interesting that what they put forward, thinking this was a vote winner, which any common sense reading tells you this is basically a kind of neo-colonial xenophobia, put it very bluntly. I mean, this is cash for humans. And it's getting rid, instead of responsibility sharing, which is, of course, at the heart of the Refugee Convention, negotiated 70 years ago, and Britain played a role in doing that, all about sharing out responsibility across the world. Instead of that, Britain is trying to bring the gates down and thinks it can continue to do that. And it thinks it can gain electoral applause, if you like, for doing that. I hope, and many others hope, it is actually wrong on that. And we've seen, for example, with Ukraine in recent weeks and months, very strong sympathy for refugees trying to get to the UK, and which I think took the British government by surprise. Very, very strong criticism for the failures of the government to deal properly with that issue. So we'll see where it goes. They will dig in their heels, but I really hope that, as you just alluded to in your question, they will eventually be worn down by a mixture of the court judgments and the popular opinion will say this is really should not be happening, not in our name, if you like.
What do you say to the argument that they're putting forward that this will deter people smugglers?
Yeah. So it's interesting. They play two games. On the one hand, to their base, there is a strong sense of like, we'll keep everybody out. But you're quite right that the main way that they are selling it is to say this is to deter the people smugglers. And of course, everybody would like to do that. But the fact is, there is absolutely no evidence that it will deter the people smugglers at all. Indeed, their own chief inspector for borders and immigration said so a couple of days ago. They haven't even attempted to produce any evidence of that. And of course, as anyone knows, who knows anything about the appalling situation of refugees knows very well, is on these very long journeys, people have already gone through endless dangers, really very, very crossing deserts, crossing the Mediterranean, crossing other seas or deserts or difficult situations, often on very, very prolonged journeys. So the idea that something at the end, that sort of 20-mile crossing of the channel would be stopped, and people are not really focused on that at all. They're just focused on trying to get away what is happening. They have a double narrative, I would say, because on the one hand, oh, this is such a bad prospect that people will stop coming. And then in parallel to that, they are saying, look, actually, it's all going to be marvelous for you, and you'll be put up in these marvelous hotels and you'll live very well. They, I would say, can't work out which of those stories they want. They can't quite get their stories straight on that one.
Is it obvious to you at this point that the people that are being targeted, is there some kind of profiling in terms of who gets on the plane and who gets to stay in England?
Yeah, a good question as well. I mean, people are definitely asking the question of if it's Ukrainians, do they get somehow not included in the mix, which is pretty hypocritical if that is the case. It's also interesting that Syrians, for example, which the British government, which I strongly welcome, a few years ago, or back 7 years ago now, in 2015, introduced a scheme making it much easier for Syrian refugees to arrive in the UK. Apparently, some of those who are being put into this plane are themselves from Syria. But certainly we are seeing, there was a mix from Afghanistan, from Iraq, I think Sudan was there as well. There were a number of different countries. And the government would, of course, claim that it's not profiling. They're merely putting people on who haven't made a good case. But the catch-22, the difficulty that the government has built into this is they do not allow people to make the case. They define people as illegal by the very fact of turning up without paperwork without all of the correct paperwork in place when they arrive at the UK border or on UK territory. And of course, that's impossible, because the fact is, if you tried to catch a plane from anywhere in the world to Heathrow and you didn't have the right visa already, you wouldn't be allowed to get on the plane. The UK government has already made sure that airlines are punished if they dare to let someone on the plane. And so, of course, people are making those illegal, or those informal journeys, those unauthorized journeys, if you like. And then when they arrive, they're throwing them. At the moment, it feels as though there wasn't very much system to those who were put onto this plane. But I think we had too few numbers to be able to know about that. What we do know is that the judges, who remain independent, I'm glad to say, and who knows what their politics are. I imagine it's a mixture of left, right, and centre. But those judges pretty much unanimously looked at those individual cases and said, well, this person should not, this person should not, and this person should not. And that's what's been happening in short order in the past couple of days. The government system at the moment is what can only be described as a kind of amoral or immoral chaos. They throw ideas out there. The Prime Minister himself is under significant pressure for a bunch of other reasons, including for his lack of trustworthiness, to be honest, is where he's heavily criticised in many different regards. And this policy is, many people would argue, trying to distract from his own problems at home.
All right, so is it about the destination, or is it just about how can you farm them off? Yeah,
I think it's a mixture of both. So Rwanda is, of course, has a troubling human rights record of its own. Opponents of the regime are regularly locked up. There's forced disappearance. There are deaths. There's a lot of problems there. Indeed, my own organisation, Freedom from Torture, some of those who have arrived in the UK as torture survivors and walked through our doors for the rehabilitation, which my colleagues, the therapists and psychologists, provide, some of those have come from Kagame's Rwanda, having suffered torture there. So the human rights record of Rwanda is troubling. In addition to that, the refugee processing is pretty much non-existent. And the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, has been extremely strong in criticizing that. The UN has described as catastrophic the plans and the lack of protections that the UK has put in place in terms of its agreement. But it must be said that even if it wasn't Rwanda, with all the troubles that go with that, it's still, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of pretty much flying in the face of the Refugee Convention and everything it stands for. The Refugee Convention was created in 1951 as a reaction to all the grotesque failures of immigration policy, especially, but not only, but certainly in Europe, very, very terrible failures during Hitler's rule, during the Holocaust. And there was a sense after the Second World War, we need to do this better. And responsibility sharing, and above all, letting people cross the border and then asking the questions after they've crossed the border. That lies at the absolute heart of the Refugee Convention. And that is being torn up by this. It's like, nothing to do with us, let somebody else deal with it. Britain takes far fewer refugees than other countries in any case. Of course, it's always countries which are closer to conflict areas which tend to end up taking more. So Poland at the moment from Ukraine, for example, or Lebanon and Turkey from Syria, and so on and so forth. And true across Africa as well, the same pattern. But UK, islands at the northwestern end of Europe, has fewer than Germany, has fewer than France, has fewer than Italy, fewer than Greece, both per head of population and in literal terms. So what they're trying to do is just to get rid of any of this completely. And the politicians give entirely inaccurate versions of what's happening. So I think many ordinary Britons would believe that we have more refugees than other countries in Europe, and that's completely false. So there's two things there. To go back to your question, therefore, on the one hand, there's the Rwanda issue, but to be honest, even if there were a country with a much better rights record, what kind of decision is it that a government just picks people up and dumps them thousands of miles away, pays a check and says, well, we'll give you some money so you sort this problem for us because we don't want to have anything to do with this problem. You're trying to cut yourself off from being part of the world in a way that I think is both immoral. It is, as the archbishops and bishops said this week, it is shaming for Britain, and I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree with Prince Charles, the heir to the throne, who is reported privately, persuasively reported to have said that it was appalling what was happening. But this government doesn't really seem to think in moral terms about being part of a bigger world and needing to play its part in part of a bigger world. I don't know how that will play out at the Commonwealth Summit, which of course is coming up very soon in Kigali. But certainly seen here in the UK, it has been a pretty shaming episode that we're still going through with what the British government is trying to do.
Steve Crawshaw, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, that's Steve Crawshaw, who's the Freedom from Torture's Director of Policy and Advocacy, talking to us about this ongoing issue about sending asylum seekers in the UK by plane to Rwanda, a partnership between Rwanda and the British government, where the UK government pays Rwanda to take in these asylum seekers, and a lot of people are not happy at all that the UK is not doing its bit to look after genuine asylum seekers.